Well, back in the 1960s and 1970s, many automakers were embracing a, shall we say, not so great idea, and that was the phenolic or plastic timing gear that you see here. Notice that the main body of the gear is actually metal, but the teeth are plastic. And this is an example from a Chevrolet 350 small block. And notice there's various cracks and even pieces missing out of the outer edge of the timing gear that has the teeth on it. Of course, what happens then? Well, you start breaking a tooth or two that puts more strain on the remaining teeth, and then eventually it just crumbles to pieces, ends up in the oil pan, potentially clogs the oil pump pickup, and also, well, the engine may stop running because the valves are simply not rotating. So this was not a great idea, and many different cars had this. Like I said, this was a Chevrolet 350, but Pontiac V8s used this, Oldsmobile V8s used this, Ford V8s used this, some of the big blocks that I know of, as well as some of the small blocks. Chrysler even used it on some engines. And the idea was that it was quieter, and I suspect it was also cheaper than having these teeth be made out of metal. So automakers perceived it to be relatively beneficial, but these things had to be replaced every, let's say, 50 to 75,000 miles, potentially even sooner. And that just was not a great idea. Well, today there's kind of an analogous idea that's being put into practice and has been for some time. And that is that many automakers now are using wet belts on their engines as opposed to dry belts. And this applies to not only camshafts and timing belts, but also oil pump belts. They're using wet belts to drive oil pumps. So what's going on here? Well, belt drive systems are really no surprise and have been around for a long period of time on many different cars. Timing belts not just have been used on Hondas as well as GM cars and Ford cars and Mopars. And timing belts these days are relatively reliable. They do have service intervals. It depends, maybe 80 to 120,000 miles oftentimes. Some people prefer a timing chain versus a timing belt because they're basically maintenance-free, although that's a debatable topic because quite a few cars that do have timing chains actually have issues associated with timing chain wear or stretching or the wear of the guides that keep the timing belt aligned and flowing appropriately around the engine. And so I don't know what's necessarily better, the belt or the chain, but I would say most of the setups are relatively reliable these days. However, there's been a new technique that many automakers are employing, and that is to have these belts submerged in oil. Now, why in the world would you have a belt submerged in oil? Often you would think that oil would impregnate the belt, and then that would cause it to degrade. And once it degrades, of course, then if it's driving your oil pump, you no longer have oil pressure. And if it's driving your camshafts, well, the valves stop moving. The thought was here a couple things. One was that a technology had been developed such that the belts could appropriately withstand being submerged in oil, and so the durability concern was no longer an issue. The second issue that automakers were trying to address with these wet belt setups was that of internal friction and consequently power loss. Now, a dry belt versus a wet belt tends to take more power because of those friction losses. And so by having the belt kind of sling around in the oil, you're reducing the internal friction of the engine. That helps improve fuel economy. And I guess thirdly, another reason behind the usage of wet belts is that they're relatively quiet. The dry belts, I've never really discerned an issue with dry belts, but I guess one could say that having the belt slinging around in the oil also helps to reduce noise because you get oil coating not only the belt, but of course the teeth of the gears that it's riding around. And so that reduces the overall noise that's being produced from the engine. Now, it sounds good, but in practice, what a number of buyers of cars with these types of setups have, let's say, encountered is premature belt failure. And this can span a number of vehicles. In Europe, Peugeots and some Citroëns use the wet belt setup. Ford, on a number of EcoBoost engines, uses wet timing belts. For instance, on its 1.0 liter EcoBoost, wet oil pump drive belts on the 2.7 liter EcoBoost engine. And even GM is getting into the game. The new Chevrolet Trax, Buick Envista with the 1.2 liter three-cylinder has a wet belt setup, as does the 3 liter Duramax diesel. Now, I have to say that the early setups were more trouble-prone than what is being employed today. It seems as though some of the early belt setups that were being used were just not able to take the wear, or at least last for the wear intervals. But now most of these wet belt setup engines have wear intervals of around 150,000 miles for these wet belts. And I would say they're getting to the point where they're becoming more reliable now. Like I said, the early ones, the belts would start degrading, and then not only do you have the risk of the belt snapping, but for instance, if it's driving anything and it starts to degrade, well, what happens? Chunks of the belt fall off, and where do they go? They go into the oil pan, and then what happens to them? You risk that the oil pickup, there's a screen on the oil pickup, but that they start blocking that screen, and then you start to lose oil pressure, not because the belt snapped, but just because the belt has been degrading and there's lots of internal debris inside the engine. So one of the things I just wanted to point out is I'm not going to provide an exhaustive list of which engines use these types of setups. I did just detail a few that have them. But if you're looking to procure a new vehicle, it might be something that you just want to look out for, especially if you're somebody who intends on keeping your car past 150,000 miles. With a 150,000 mile service interval, these belts are often not easy to get to or even check. For instance, if you want to check the condition of the wet belt that's employed on the 3 liter Duramax diesel, you're basically removing or separating the transmission from the engine so that you can get access to take a look at that particular belt. Now, it's not necessarily a huge deal if it's every 150,000 miles, but again, it just depends on what your overall driving habits are and how long you intend to keep the car and how long you want it to last. So it's something to be aware of. I highly recommend just checking to see if the vehicle that you're buying has one of these setups. And if so, be aware that it's something that may be a wear item, and you also might want to check the internet forums for reliability to discern if that particular engine has some issues or not. I will say on some of the Ford EcoBoost engines, the earlier models did have issues with these wet belts. Same with the Peugeots and Citroëns that I mentioned before. And now I would say the belts and that technology has evolved even in the past couple years to the point where they become increasingly reliable. But for my preference, I still would tend to shy away from one of these setups. And since many of my viewers are fans of classic cars, I will also point out that you may want to have your timing gears changed if you don't know if they've ever been changed in your 60s or 70s era vehicle. Do some research to discern if the car and that engine used phenolic gears. And again, you want to get those changed. You don't want those teeth crumbling and making their way into the oil pan and potentially clogging the pickup tube. That's just bad news overall. And like I said, many different engines. This is not an exhaustive list, but various years of Pontiac V8s, Oldsmobile V8s, Chevrolet V8s, Ford engines, Mopar engines, all employed that kind of timing gear setup. And I've had some of my cars, one of my Ford 460s and my 73 LTD, I had the water pump replaced because it was starting to get a little noisy. I could tell the bearing had some play in it. And at the same time, I just told my mechanic, well, go ahead and replace the timing gear because you're already halfway there. You've got the water pump off, and you have a few more steps before you can replace that. And I'm glad I said that because when I got the phenolic gear back, it had some cracks in it. None of the plastic was missing, but it was clearly going to fail in the not too distant future. So now anytime I have one of my Ford big blocks that needs a water pump, I just have the timing gear replaced as well. So what do you think of this idea that automakers have, these wet belt systems. Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know if you've experienced any failures or if they've been relatively reliable for you. Thanks again for watching.